Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Well, we've been exposed to, inundated with almost numerous different reports of what's going on in Kiev, Ukraine, in the last numerous months, but the last couple of weeks in regards to missile barrages and other attacks. And so I thought I'd check in with Sean Almeida, who's originally from Boston, Massachusetts. He's a former U.S. Marine and Columbia University graduate, but he's been living in Kiev, Ukraine for more than 11 years. And he's posted on social media. He's been interviewed by numerous different media places about what's life like in the capital city of Ukraine. Sean, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Brian, for having me.
My pleasure. So how was last night?
Last night was a bit easier to deal with than other nights. I could hear some stuff, but it was further off, not as persistent. I mean, when the Patriot was first used, that's when the Russians really tried to get at the Patriot itself. So it was like a barrage of like 30 plus missiles within, 15 minutes or something. So it was very, very intense. Last night, just kind of sporadic. And the city's quite wide. I live in the center. The city's quite wide. So I can have a good view from my apartment. So I can see off to the left. There'll be something off to the right, a little bit. But generally speaking, it's fine. It's just hard to get back to sleep after. You get a little wound up and then you're trying to get to sleep. So a lot of people are very tired walking around the city.
Now, do you go to a bomb shelter? Do you stay where you are? What do you do?
So I'm here alone. My family's in Europe, so they're not here. So personally, there's a small risk that something could fall on my apartment. I consider it a very small risk. So personally, I don't go to bomb shelters. One of the locals, if they have children, they definitely try to, if they have access to it, or the metro stations count as bomb shelters, or they go inside. We've got the 2-wall rule. They say, like, get behind a second wall within the apartment. Ideally, it doesn't have any glass or windows. That way, if something does hit, you're less likely to get hit by debris and things like that. A lot of international organizations here impose the rule on their employees that they have to go to a bomb shelter every time. So you have to get up, get dressed, go downstairs or wherever next door. And after it's all, they've been lasting 3-4 hours, the actual official alarm period. So sometimes they're up, for 4 hours, and then they have to go back, try to get to sleep, or go straight to work sometimes too. So it's pretty hard on people.
If your family's in Europe, why are you still there?
Well, I have my business here. And also, I strongly believe in the future of Ukraine in spite of it all. I'm not like most people that I know, very optimistic in general about how things will go after the victory, we like to say. It seems a bit presumptuous, but, people are very confident here that, with the West support and the fighting spirit of the Ukrainians themselves, that things will go well. So I didn't want to abandon the country. I've been here a long time. I consider it my home. My daughter was born here. So for me, it's important to be with people that are here as well, because people start to count who's here during the war, and people who come back after trying to do business, they're going to have a harder time than those who are here too, for sure.
You think it'll really separate into those that stayed and those that left?
It'll be an advantage. I'm not saying they'll ban anybody. I mean, they're going to need all the help they can get, but for sure, especially things are changing, economy's changing, businesses have to change to adjust everything. So if you try to do that later, you're going to have a much harder time. And, I've had this business for a long time, and I want to keep it going, keep it growing. So to abandon it for a year, 2 years while the war is over and then come back, it just wouldn't be something that could be possible. I'd have to abandon Ukraine, and that's something I wasn't ready to do. I'm not ready to do.
I read an article that you said recently that the population of Kiev is almost back to pre-war levels.
That's correct. It was about 3.7, 3.8 pre-war. And they don't go off census data. Usually they actually use the cell phone networks to get a proper estimate. It's much more indicative. So, several 100,000 left right away, including, me and my family. And now we're back up to about 3.6 million. And what that is, it isn't even necessarily coming back from Europe or Western Ukraine where they're hiding out. It's people moving here from other cities, like probably from the East where things have been more intense. So there's that growth. And then it's going to continue to grow even if the war continues another year. Like during this year, it's expected to grow another about 10%. And so that doesn't include those who would come back from Europe. So the city is already pretty full right now. So it's going to be pretty interesting to see how it grows.
So I've spoken to numerous different refugees that have fled to Poland, to Germany, et cetera, and often with fathers, males left behind fighting. So it's the female and the kids that have moved. There's a lot of people that have still got to come back or could come back, are there not?
for sure. I mean, there's definitely millions, and I cross the border a lot because I like to go visit my family about once a month, for about 10 days to 2 weeks. So I cross the border a lot. I'm usually the only guy or one of the very few, older men can leave. So kids under 18, men over 60 can leave. So there might be 3 or 4, maybe 5 guys on the bus getting to Poland. Well, again, all women in it, but I think there's a lot of commuters too. There's people that go back and forth. They come visit the family, they come home for holiday, but they're living there. The kids are in school there, so they don't want to leave. Leave yet. But there's a lot of cross-border stuff. I think that'll continue, but estimates of who will actually come back permanently, yeah, it varies. I've seen as low as maybe 30% might come back because they're getting used to living there and maybe they settled in a bit. And the kids are in school. So, but I think that'll depend on how much reconstruction starts and how much people can start improving the country while making some decent money. I mean, if they're going to pay Ukrainians poorly for the reconstruction, like cheap labor, then fewer people will come back. But if they kind of increase the salaries for Ukrainians, I think a lot more will come back to 30%, probably 60, maybe 70% would be my estimate.
These attacks from Russia, are they trying to take out the Patriot air missile defense system, or are they trying to terrorize the population?
Well, the terror stuff is always in the background, whether they say it or not. I mean, Ukrainians, I thought I was pretty cynical about Russia. So I lived in Russia before. I speak Russian fluently. My Ukrainian's okay. It's getting better, but in Kiev, it's pretty normal. But anyway, so I thought I was pretty cynical about Russia, since 2014 especially. But since the war started, I kept telling my friends, how could they do that? And he said, you don't understand how low they can go. So terror is definitely a part of it. And they're throwing everything. They're doing different mixes. There's maybe all like 50 drones one night, a mixture of drones and missiles another night, ballistic missiles, sometimes cruise missiles. So I think when the Patriot was implemented like about 2 weeks ago, they definitely went for that mostly. But other than that, they try to knock out infrastructure to make life uncomfortable. They'll say it's for military purposes, but they were really, especially during the winter, they were trying to, so I think a lot of people didn't understand. They weren't just trying to knock out electricity. So they have these heating stations that heat hot water. And hot water is also the hot water that's used for the heating. So there's like electricity, hot water like used for showers, and heating was basically trying to be knocked out constantly by the Russians. It's just they wanted to flood us and make it too cold or untenable for civilians to stay here and have another refugee. So that seems to be their goal. Plus, trying to hit the Patriot and kind of maybe make some point that they're superior to American systems, but that has not been the case. So
I misunderstood. Is there only one Patriot? I thought there was a couple or several. There's only one?
So there's two systems, but each system is made up of like 18 components. There's multiple launchers, they have radar systems. So even if they knock out one launcher, it doesn't mean they destroyed the Patriot, right? So they'll say, we knocked out the Patriot, but they knock out a launcher, it's like a tentacle that can grow back, basically. Or if they're knocking a radar, they can use other radars. So apparently there are 2 full systems. One is in Kiev at least, maybe 2, maybe the other one is in the east somewhere. So the OPSEC here is really good. People do not talk about this stuff. So we're just left guessing, just like anybody abroad watching the news. I mean, our guess is as good as yours. So
what's life like?
So I would say at this point, you would never know there's a war. Like if you walk around the street and just saw people like enjoying life in the center of Kiev, especially like restaurants are open, the bars. I mean, there's curfew at midnight. So everyone has to be home by midnight off the street. There's patrols walking around. So no cars, no pedestrians can be outside. So besides that though, I mean, if you want to go get, like I just had lunch outside, like I said, it was just a gorgeous day right now, about 25 degrees or I don't know, whatever, 75, 80 degrees Fahrenheit. All the shops are open. I mean, it's surprisingly normal. Ukrainians are very resilient. So even yesterday, there was a bomb attack during the day, which is the first time in months, I think, that there was one during the day. Like you could hear all the anti-air defenses over. I could see it over our heads, flying overhead. Within 20 minutes after, people were back on the street and just, you'd be surprised if people can get used to after all this time. So
that is amazing. What about kids? Can kids get used to it?
Unfortunately, yeah. I think, I mean, yes, there was a video, it's hard to watch, but they were so apparently one of the schools at least doesn't have a shelter in the building. So a lot of them do, but not all of them. So they were taking the kids to the shelter when some of the missiles and stuff started flying overhead, and the kids start screaming. So I think some of the stresses will be with people for a long time. But in general, you see people pushing strollers around with their babies and going to the park and stuff. And I think what the big advantage compared to earlier last year was that there's apps where let you know there's an alarm, and then you can actually go and see what it is. They'll say 30 missiles are coming to Kiev in 20 minutes, flying over from Russia or Belarus. That way you'd actually, you have time. You also know when you have more information, it's a bit less stressful. People can plan ahead and say, all right, depending on what the threat is, I'm going to do this, and stuff like that. So I think people do get used to it. I'm glad my daughter's not here, to deal with the stress. She has much more time to, play during her formative years. But I think most of the kids here, yeah, they've gotten used to it.
We're chatting today with Sean Almeida, who's from Boston, Massachusetts, but living right now in Kiev, Ukraine. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes and chat a little bit more about, what's life like and what's going on. Stay with us, everyone. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm chatting tonight with Sean Almeida. He's originally from Boston, Massachusetts. He's a former U.S. Marine and Columbia University graduate. He's living and has been living in Ukraine, Kiev, Ukraine, for more than 11 years. And we're chatting tonight about what life's like in Kiev. We're going to chat about the war and the future of Ukraine, and maybe Sean, we could just take a step back. What brought you to Kiev? And why would a former Marine, someone from Boston, Massachusetts, which I think is one of the most beautiful cities in the world, want to be living in Kiev, Ukraine?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of Ukrainians ask me that question as well. Because if you're from there, we want to go there? Usually they say something like that. But for me, as a Marine, I got exposed to some incredible stuff. I worked abroad at embassies as a security guard within the Marines, and I got exposed to the former Soviet Union. So I became very interested. So when I went to go study, I selected kind of Russia as my focus and Russian language also. So I picked it up, and I studied in Moscow in 2007, and I visited Kiev after that. And at the time, it sounds kind of crazy given how much has changed in 15 years, but at the time it's kind of like if Moscow was New York, then Kiev was like Boston in terms of fairly close culturally, not that far away. You can take a night train and come to Kiev. So I ended up finding an internship here also for a few months to live in Kiev. So I always liked it, but it was a bit rough back then. It was kind of definitely had more of a Soviet feel, a little bit just kind of, it was hard to find good services. But so then I moved back to Moscow after I finished at Columbia and worked there. And I kept thinking about Kiev. I come visit and I really liked it. And I realized there's so much more opportunity here because it's not as developed as Moscow. Russia's, I would say, kind of a backwards place, to be honest. You can see what they're doing to this country. But Moscow is very wealthy, very developed. And in Kiev, I just saw opportunity. I met someone who was doing real estate, and he was younger than me. And I was like, well, if you're doing it, I could probably try to do it. So I ended up, 2012, just moving here and starting to do it, working for somebody else for a couple of years before starting my own business. And every year it just gets better. So if I didn't see it getting better, I didn't see the potential, I wouldn't stay here. I don't like to stand still. And of course, like you said, Boston's great. I could have done okay in Boston, and then, but I really like how interesting it is here and how much it's always developing and moving forward.
And your business is real estate?
I have a real estate business, yeah.
Building apartments or shopping centers or what?
No, so it's residential. We focus in the very center of Kiev, which Kiev is a very historical city. So it's a well over 1,000-year-old city. So we focus in the historical center. We work with other expats, so people like me working for embassies or right now organizations like the Red Cross and the UN. So we tend to find them rentals. We also work with investor owners who buy through us individual apartments. We renovate them and rent them out and manage it and kind of do a full service thing. So it's kind of like an ecosystem for foreigners living in Ukraine, where the owner is an investor foreigner, usually the tenant's a foreigner, and then we help manage the property and be the go-between. So
I spent some time in Kiev in 2006, 7, 8, so comparable time period to you. And there was a lot of corruption. And I couldn't imagine being involved in the real estate business. I was looking for pharmaceutical assets at the time, and everyone warned me about different people that would be coming asking for money. Is that, an accurate depiction of what was, and has it changed?
I think it depends on the specific sphere that you're in. Generally, like if you're trying to be a developer here, the waters are very, very muddy. I don't know of any foreign developer that has had a lot of success here, unless they lived here. Like there's an expat guy who's done very well, but he's been here like 30 years, so he knows the lay of the land. But in terms of a foreign developer saying, "Oh, I'll just come over and just start building, getting permits," I mean, it's very murky. It's a very difficult system. But what I do, buying individual apartments in older buildings, it's very under the radar. So you kind of just like basically buying a condo. So there's, it's intentional too. I want to keep a low profile, and I mean, doing publicity stuff like that. But I don't like if you're breaking the ground with a tractor or bulldozers, things like that, you're gonna draw a lot of attention from people that might come squeeze you. But when you're doing individual apartments, renting it out to some diplomat or embassy, like people aren't gonna want to bother you. So I personally or professionally don't have to deal with that. But there are a lot of ways to end up in the web that you can get caught up in for sure, and that's still prevalent in certain. I mean, they've cleaned it up a lot, but there's a long way to go to get to the Western European / American kind of transparency.
When I was there, there were a lot of business people from Russia, either permanently or on a temporary basis. You know, some of the biggest banks were Russian banks. There were a lot of Germans. There were a lot of people from Belarus. There were some people from Moldova that I interacted with. Are there a lot of non-Ukrainians in Kiev today?
In terms of people, yeah. In terms of business owners, like banks, and like, so it was really thinned out. So you were there before the bubble pops. I mean, the bubble. Real estate bubble, credit bubble, whatever we want to call it, really affected Ukraine just as much as kind of anyone else. So prices really dropped down, and a lot of weaker, businesses went under. And then when the war initially started in 2014, that's when you saw a lot of Russians get pushed out. Russian banks were closed. The one I used to work for in Moscow had a branch here, and they basically got their credit strangled, and they went under. Like the Ukrainian government did it intentionally. And a lot of other banks that were weaker and didn't have a lot of assets, they went under and were closed forcefully. Other businesses as well. And then the Russian ownership, yeah, it's still there. It's gotten much weaker. They even own, or at least somewhat controlled even proper news channels that were pro-Russian basically up until this full invasion. Even. So, yeah, the Russians really had deep roots here in a way, but I would say more than 90% have been rooted out, unless they've somehow got citizenship here and proved that they're loyal to Ukraine, then they probably won't have much issues. But the other ones that are more nefarious and basically working for the Kremlin, it's been rooted out significantly.
We see here, pictures of incredible devastation. I guess not in Kiev, but in cities to the east. What's Ukraine going to do to build back?
I think they're still working on an overall plan. Plus, obviously the donors and the Western organizations are going to have a big say. I think a lot of the stuff you've seen totally destroyed will not be rebuilt, at least not in the way we think. But Bakhmut is the most recent example. I mean, it's been totally devastated because they were built and kind of working under more or less Soviet economics, and they were built for certain reasons. So now if you add in all the mines and unexploded ordnance, I think places like that don't make a lot of economic sense either won't be rebuilt at all. They'll just be demined as much as possible, and maybe rebuilt. Other towns maybe nearby might be expanded, things like that. Or if it's still economically valuable in terms of extracting resources, I think it might be more of a kind of like a deployment or like an oil field type thing, where the guys go out there for a month with other families, month on, month off type thing, because it's too dangerous and too ecologically disastrous to really go back anytime in the next couple of decades. So that's kind of my guess for some of it. Others probably will be rebuilt, especially the ports and things like that still have a lot of value. Mariupol, for example, I think has a lot of value to be rebuilt, but others that have been destroyed probably not.
What's the infrastructure like? We see these, descriptions of Biden and others coming by train from Poland. Are the trains still running? Are the highways still there? Are the airports alive and well?
So there are no flights allowed over Ukraine. So the airports, I think the Russians did do a couple of bombings on the tarmacs to kind of send a signal. So they haven't flown. I mean, except for the military ones, they haven't flown any civilian planes out of there. So that's probably nothing too structural in terms of damage. The highways are fine. I mean, there's a lot of highways going west that have been modernized over the last few years. So I take the bus mostly, and highways themselves mostly have no issues. No, the major bridge in the west of Kiev, Bucha area, that was destroyed is being rebuilt, and they have kind of a temporary workaround that works fine. So that's fine. The trains also, they struck trains are very redundant, so it's really hard to knock out the train system. They have the spare parts to replace the stuff, but also there's multiple routes, and electricity is really hard to cut off, things like that. So infrastructure actually is working okay. I mean, Ukraine needed a reconstruction before this war. I'll tell people that too, because a lot of this stuff it was old when the Soviet Union collapsed, and it's been 30 years with just kind of like repairs, no major overhaul. But generally speaking, electricity is fine, water is fine. The trains, more or less, it's completely fine. And Ukraine is a country of heroes. So I tell people, the people out there fixing the stuff, under threat of bombings or putting out fires and rescuing people. I mean, they've kept the country running during this. It's not just the soldiers in the east.
Sean, I got to tell you, I'm amazed at this conversation and frankly, some others I've had at how resilient, Ukrainian people are, but I guess, people are in a time of war. You're living through what I would have read in a book or a movie. I would have been like a World War II kind of existence. And yet you're doing your business and you're taking buses and you're going out for lunch outside on a sunny day. Explain that to me. How can people be so resilient in the face of such incredible strife, a war like World War II all over again?
Yeah, well, I think that's part of it. I mean, a lot of them look at their grandparents who fought on the Soviet side and say, if they could do it, we can do it. But also, after Soviet Union, it was nice in Kiev. I mean, there were some food shortages like Soviet, hard times, but people, it was still pretty nice. But then the 90s, it was really rough for Ukrainians. So people grew up with really tough parents who got them through the tough days. In the 90s, it was violent, because things had fallen apart pretty quickly. So things were up in the air, and a lot of violent thugs used the opportunity to kind of take over things. Scarcity, until the 2000s, things didn't really stabilize. So I think it's kind of built into them. But also, I think it's just motivation. Like, they really love living here. Like I do. I love living here. In spite of the war, I'd look around and I say, I wish my family were here, but I really can't imagine where else I'd want to live, at this point. It's so interesting, and the city's really pleasant and stuff like that. So that the motivation also, it's not just like being tough, brainlessly tough. I mean, they want to be here. This is my country. This is my city. I want to stay here. I want to join the Western Club of Nations. They don't want to be post-Soviet. They don't like being called post-Soviet. I think there hasn't been a replacement term yet, even though factually it is. They were Soviet at one point. They consider it kind of an occupation. So they want to join the Western standard of living and the democracy, and they want all that. So they haven't got it yet. So some of them are they left, but a lot of them want to come back. But the ones that are here, they want to build this into what it is in the West, and not just run to the West. If you know what I mean.
When I was there really was two solitudes. And, maybe I'm sort of overly focused on that because some people would say there's two solitudes in Canada with the French fact in Quebec and the English elsewhere. But it would appear to me, and I was doing business in Kiev, I had meetings with Russian-speaking people. I had meetings with Ukrainian-speaking people. I had meetings with people that were from Russian banks, and people were from Ukrainian or German or English banks. I went to the east to some city whose name I can't pronounce. It had 26 letters or something like that, and it was very industrial. It felt like Pittsburgh or Philadelphia or Hamilton, Ontario, and then I went to the west to, I think it's called Lvov, and it was a beautiful city, but it was very agrarian, and it appeared like there were almost two solitudes, two cultures. Has that changed? Mm-hmm. Is it one culture today?
I would say it's much more united than it's ever been by far. I mean, people who wanted to be Russian, guess what? Great opportunity to move to Russia, which they started saying in 2014. Like, you don't have to start a war and take apart this country if you want to live in Russia. It's right there. So I think there's a much better melding. I don't think you can say it's one culture or two separate cultures either. It's kind of a melding or kind of a gradient thing. Yeah, it's much more Ukrainian in Lviv where you were. The history there is also more Catholic, and then starting to go east, it's like a scale where you start to get more Russian speakers. But in terms of Kiev, I would say everyone knows both languages. I know couples where one member of the pair there speaks Ukrainian, the other speaks Russian. That's just how they live. They both know languages equally. They just have a slight preference because they spoke with their parents or whatever. Or people have parents who are like that. One's actually from Russia originally, and one is Ukrainian, so they speak both languages as native languages. Some people are in Kiev trying to speak Ukrainian. They're kind of like me, trying to speak Ukrainian, but not very good at it. But they understand it, like me again. So it's really just it's hard. I mean, I think Canada is a great example. I tell Ukrainians, they didn't have to, like, those who maybe want one way or the other. Mostly they'd say get rid of Russian. I was like, I don't think you have to get rid of Russian because other countries, they do this too. Switzerland, another great example. You can have a peaceful country even though people speak different languages. It doesn't mean you're the enemy, I think, or something like that. So, but it's evolving still. I mean, Kiev was definitely a majority Russian speaking city before when you were here, and even until the 14, and even up to a couple of years ago. I think it's kind of reaching a tipping point where it's getting to a majority Ukrainian speaking. At least all the signs, every restaurant, people, all the menus are in Ukrainian now. Where a couple even 2 years ago, you could see maybe a lot still in Russian. So in that sense, it's switching. But if you speak Russian, it's not a problem either. People will speak Russian back to you. I mean, it's very rarely any kind of tension. It's just.
I understand that 1 in 4 Ukrainians has a blood relative living across the border in Russia. How is that? What's this done to families?
Yeah, no, it's been terrible. You have some who are supportive, but a lot of them in Russia, they just can't believe it. They say, what are you doing over there? Why are you guys faking it? To the relatives. They say, why are you not getting bombed? We're not bombing you. We're bombing the Nazis, And they said, my building was just hit last night, and they just like, no, it can't be possible. So here's some real horror stories. So a lot of people just don't talk to their family members. I've had, not family, but I've had friends. Again, I lived in Russia before for 2 years, and yeah, we don't talk, or they'll see my post and delete me from Facebook. They think I'm creating something, and I don't really care personally. It's unfortunate for them to be thinking that way, but yeah, no, it's torn apart families for sure. Even the story is kind of like the American Civil War. The son is fighting on the Ukrainian side, and the father is fighting with the rebels in Donbass region. If you can imagine, they just don't agree with each other, and it's a tragedy, of course.
It's unbelievable what you're living through. It's just unbelievable. I can't imagine what it would be like to live your life and the life of everyone else in Ukraine. But I'm so glad that you're as resilient as you are. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting today about Ukraine, Kiev, and our guest is Sean Almeida, who lives right now in Kiev, and talking to us via Zoom from Kiev, where he's in business. And he's interesting because he's originally an American from Boston, Massachusetts. He's a former U.S. Marine and a Columbia University graduate. He spent time in Moscow. He spent time in Russia. He spent time in Kiev, and he's now been living in Ukraine for over 11 years. Sean, what's going to happen? What do you think is going to happen? What do the people that you meet with for lunch think is going to happen? What's the prognosis?
Yeah, obviously nobody speaks with that much confidence. They believe in the military here. I have a good friend. He's fighting. He was in Kherson late last year, and he's been fighting in Bakhmut, but he joined up. He's a medical doctor, and he joined up in March of last year. So he's not going to stop. I tried to tell him to take a break, get a month off the line. He just will not stop. And Ukrainians are the same way. They don't think this is an electoral thing, like just getting land back. They think this is existential, because the rhetoric that you see, if you look between the lines and listen to propaganda, not just what Putin says. Putin didn't say that, but people who speak for the Kremlin on TV, they say some really nasty things, like stuff that's drowned Ukrainian children, stuff like that. So this to them, they won't feel safe if they just stop here and draw the line in the sand and say, okay, the war is over, because they just feel like 8 years later, Russia will try again, and they'll destroy more cities when they try again. So what's going to happen? I think the biggest question mark that decides how long this goes, is kind of the NATO factor, or security guarantees from the West, basically. So if NATO came in and said today, okay, stop the war, and then we'll protect everything that's still Ukrainian, would Ukrainians go for that? Maybe not, but that would be something start to already discuss and say we can save our boys' lives and women's lives if we stop now. If it's just like, please stop the war, like China's trying to say, just stop the war and end bloodshed, Ukraine doesn't see it as ending bloodshed. Calling a ceasefire does not end the war, it just delays it for another generation. So they want to get this done. So again, it really depends on how talks go. But even if the West and U.S. stop sending weapons, they're not going to stop fighting. They just don't see it as an option. They're just, we're going to stop fighting, because they see what the Russians will do. They'll make progress. They'll come over here and do worse things further west. So, I think the NATO factor is the largest one that decides how long and how far this goes.
There's been some media reports of, I guess it's Russian people that are sympathetic to Ukraine actually attacking into Russia itself. Should Ukraine either directly or indirectly support any incursions back into Russia?
Yeah, I don't see it as an escalation. I mean, I think these guys were. I mean, these Russians who invaded Russia, they had U.S. equipment, machine guns, and vehicles, things like that. So obviously, they got them from Ukraine, and Ukraine used the same rhetoric. It's funny, it's a little bit of trolling, especially if you speak the language. You can get it like they use the exact same language that Russia used it when they took Crimea. But they said, "Oh, those are just little green men. We don't know where they came from. We don't know where the weapons came from." So Ukrainians or the Russians who invaded just say the same thing. No, we didn't get them from Ukraine. We just found them at the military surplus store. So I don't see this as an escalation at all. I mean, everyone's always scared of what Russia's going to do, but I mean, it just seems absurd just to be worrying about that, given what they're doing to this country. And every red line they draw, they always back off. They're just bluffing. They don't really have much to fight with. So
Should Ukraine be bombing munitions storage places, oil storage places, fuel storage places, military barracks, etc., in Russia?
100%. And they've been doing it, at least some of that, whenever they had the opportunity, the weapons to do so. It's all, I mean, not doing that is fighting with one hand behind your back, and it allows the Russians to focus their forces much more sharply where they have land access over into Ukraine and like with Donbass and everything. So 100%, I think it's justified militarily. I don't support any kind of attacks on unnecessary attacks on infrastructure. Although the one town, Belgorod, which is near Ukraine, it's a very militarized town. So striking electricity there is not the same as striking electricity, in St. Petersburg, which doesn't affect the war. So, but in general, yeah, I think it's military. It's allowed by the rules of war, and it makes strategic sense whenever they decide that they have the ability to do so.
We hear, comments every day about a spring or a summer or a counteroffensive. And has it started? Is it going to start? When's it going to start? Where are they going to attack, et cetera? What's your sense of the potential probability of a counteroffensive?
Yeah, I think 100%. I think it's already happening 100%. It's a bit slower, I think if you look back, if you remember the first Gulf War, where they spent months degrading Iraq's ability to defend itself and its weapons behind the lines. That way, when the land war started, remember, it was only 4 days long for that reason. So I think Ukraine definitely has started it probably weeks ago. There's a lot of strikes behind the lines now, more than before. There's partisan attacks. They're using homemade kamikaze drones. Let's say locally sourced, not just homemade. Kamikaze drones to knock out any vehicle they can find, any transport vehicle, even a little bus, a little military truck. All those things add up in terms of degrading Russia's ability to defend itself when the actual counteroffensive starts. So people kind of maybe think it's like a marathon, or right, or like someone shoots the starter pistol and everyone takes off running. It won't quite be like that. Ukraine is fighting very smartly. They have a lot of very sharp commanders who are doing more the Western/American way of war, as opposed to the Soviet. Let's mass everyone on a line and march forward to into the meat grinder. I don't think that's what they're going to do. So I think, and they continue to surprise us, even us on the ground. We don't know what's going to happen. Even we have friends in the military, but nobody sees a big picture. So I think they'll continue to surprise us whenever they make a larger attack. But the offensive has already started.
Tell me about your attitude and your friends in Kiev's attitude toward Crimea. Is Crimea part of Ukraine? Should you be taking back Crimea? What's the attitude there? Putin says Crimea was gifted to Ukraine and was always part of Russia. Tell me what your attitude is there.
Yeah, I mean, I've been to Crimea twice before 2014. It was definitely a very pro-Russian place. So on the one hand, you understand people feel Russian and stuff, but there's still international laws that if they wanted to secede, there's a whole process they can go through. But instead, they just stole it. And at the time, I was upset that it wasn't any resistance, because I felt like if you don't resist, they're going to keep taking more. Right? Give an inch, they take a mile. And I think we kind of saw that with Donbass, where it was easy to take Crimea. They kind of thought they had a second Crimea in Donbass, and it turned into a bloody mess for both sides. So, but at the time, I had friends in Kiev at the time going, Sean, we don't care. That's 2 million votes that were for Russia, like basically voting domestically in Ukraine, where they were voting for all Russian interests. So there was also another, at the time, there was kind of logic of that. Now, for sure, I think most Ukrainian people, my friends, they definitely think we need to get back Crimea, because it's a liability, right, in terms of military access to Ukraine proper, let's say the mainland, through the peninsula of Crimea. So as long as Russia has the peninsula, then Ukraine is under threat. So for sure, again, unless NATO says we'll protect you as the lines are now and no more fighting, unless they do that, then for sure Ukraine will go for Crimea. And I read quite a little history of all the different military things that have happened in in Crimea. It's definitely not always been Russian. That's They say always is a very weird term for them. You say, what do you define always? And they say, oh, they took it 20 years ago, but it's the Tartars who are ethnic Tartars who are from there. It's just as much their land as Russian, or maybe even more so. And they're very pro-Ukrainian. There are whole units that are fighting in Ukrainian armed forces that are Tartars, ethnic Tartars from there. So I think they will go for it. I think it is possible to make it untenable to maintain. Not necessarily, it's not like a full invasion where you go over, you take over, but they can make it really uncomfortable for the Russians to hold it. And I think that's probably going to be the strategy.
Eastern Ukraine, the Donbass is, I thought, the industrial heartland of Ukraine. Can it be rebuilt?
I think it could be used as a place to be the industrial heartland without being rebuilt in the same way, again, tying it before. So I think some parts will be. Again, some of them just won't make any sense. Plus, all the demining that's going to have to happen. I mean, you've seen it. I mean, there's so much artillery that's been spent. So, especially the older Soviet stock, they have a really high failure rate. If Western ammunition might fail at a couple percent, if some of the Soviet stuff that the Russians were using could fail at 10, 20, 30%. Right? And they're shooting thousands of rounds per day. So you can do the math. So I think it'll look different, but I think it's for the extractive industries, it'll still be a very profitable place for a long time. Also, oil and gas has not been tapped in that region since the 70s. The Soviets started to ignore it a long time ago. So I think for sure, Ukraine could almost certainly be independent of imports with oil and gas just by extracting what exists on the land in Ukraine, plus near Crimea, there's some underwater deposits. This was all being worked on, invested in by foreign oil and gas companies up in 2014. There was major companies looking to sign contracts and get started, and then 2014 kind of pushed everything back. But the potential's there, and Donbass is a very wealthy area in terms of the land itself. So,
you've got an incredible long border with Russia. Even assuming you win, how can you ever be secure? How can Ukraine and Russia exist peacefully as neighbors?
Yeah, NATO is one way. The Russians, they talk tough, but they know they can't compete with NATO. As you can see, the joke is, Russia was always considered the second best army in the world, and now they're the second best army in Ukraine, right? So, so they're not as tough as they thought they were. Personally, and I think a lot of people here believe that it's possible, Russian collapse is something that would give the most security long-term for Ukraine. It's an empire. If you look at it, it's a massive, massive empire. I did the Trans-Siberian Railroad from Vladivostok to Moscow. You just see so many different regions, and it's such a massive country, but it's all different ethnic groups tied together, religions, there's different people identify with their region much more than as Russian. So it's really an empire being tied together by force, but there's a lot of pressures now, and Putin has not left a system behind that it resembles what it looked like when he took over. There's no system for replacing him. So even without the war, when Putin is removed from power or he dies or whatever, there's going to be a real mad dash for power in Russia, I think. I'm not a Russia expert or per se, but I do have enough experience in the language and studies. So that's my opinion. Russia's always been a bit wild when things start teetering. Like they're strong when they're stable. When it starts teetering, it can go really bad, right? So, and because Putin has destroyed any semblance of a democratic system for replacing him, I think it'll be a mad dash. And so I think the West collectively is not ready for it. What it looks like, they're thinking, oh, this war, let's not escalate with the Russians. But what about when it naturally has issues, domestic issues, civil war, maybe a fight for power in Moscow? When that happens, is NATO ready for that? Or, is the West ready politically for that? Russia also has a huge border with China and Central Asian countries. I mean, what does that look like if Russia starts to teeter? And so I think the war is distracting everyone from that reality that Putin will not be there forever.
Is Ukraine ready to join NATO? Is Ukraine ready to join the European Economic Union?
Psychologically, yes, I would say. There's a million little rules. I mean, I think NATO is easier prospect than the EU per se, because the EU is it's a very bureaucratic thing, and all these different rules that need to be implemented, et cetera, et cetera. They're probably further away unless they push it through. NATO, I mean, you see, they've taken on the weapons very well. They're great fighters. They add a lot of value to NATO's eastern flank in terms of protection. So I think if Ukraine had to choose, I think NATO makes more sense than EU. Like they can't have the EU wouldn't have an impact if they don't have NATO protection, right? And NATO could have a big impact, some quality of life here and investment and things like that. EU, it's the cherry on top. But personally, I'm not sure that it's something that's absolutely necessary for Ukraine's future. It's got a lot of different industries, like we talked about a few of them, plus ports around Odessa, river shipments, river shipping. Another big thing that's been neglected is down like 80% since the Soviet times. So I think Ukraine could stand alone without EU, but without NATO, living under risk, it could really stunt their development.
The Americans have now granted access to jets, which was something that Ukraine has been looking for a long period of time. Is there something else that you think the West needs to give Ukraine?
I think the ATACMS missiles. I mean, obviously the British gave the Storm Shadows and the French gave the Scalps, which are similar, but still, I think I don't see a reason why we're not giving ATACMS at this point. It's to me, it's just been every time waiting and saying, no, they can't do it, they can't deal with it, they can't this, and then they do it later. But in the meantime, the suffering of the troops and the civilians in the cities, it's just been immense. So I don't see any reason why we're not giving the ATACMS missiles for the HIMARS systems. It's really unconscionable, if you ask me.
Really? Okay. It seems like the United States is providing a fair amount of intelligence. Do you think that that the United States is actually involved in this war from a military intelligence and military planning standpoint?
Yeah, I think 100%. I think so. When they're targeting a target, they call it the kill chain. You have all these different things that go into it, intelligence and capabilities and the actual implementation, things like that. And I think for sure, the U.S. intelligence is pretty firmly set in. I mean, not taking anything away from Ukrainians; they do an amazing job of what they're given. But I think, U.S. is definitely involved.
We're having a fascinating conversation tonight about Ukraine, about an American that's actually living in Ukraine and has been for the last 11 years. We're going to take a final break and come back. And I'm going to ask Sean a little bit about the politics of the whole situation, both from a Ukrainian standpoint and from an American and NATO standpoint. Stay with us. We'll be back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Sean Almeida. He's an American, originally from Boston, Massachusetts. He's a former Marine, U.S. Marine, and Columbia University graduate who, for the last 11 years, has been living in Kiev, Ukraine. Is there now running a business, a real estate business in downtown central Kiev. And he's been talking to me tonight about life in Ukraine, about what it's like to live through a barrage of attacking missiles at night. That life has gone on. We've been talking about the war. We've been talking about prospects. We've been talking about the economic union, the European Economic Union and NATO. Sean, I wonder if you could switch for the last couple of minutes to some of the politics. I think one issue is your President Zelensky seems to have done an incredible job, but he's a former comedian. I wonder if you could comment a little bit about, what you and what people in Kiev think about the job he's done. And then, I wonder if you could comment about the politics of this whole situation internationally. Putin says he's just waiting out, or at least some people think he's just waiting out Biden's time, thinking that Trump is going to win and that the Republicans' attitude towards supporting Ukraine is going to change dramatically. You've had a situation where there were some German politicians that were less supportive than some people argued, former chancellors that have been, frankly, pro-Russian, it would appear. Macron in France that seem to, almost want détente. So tell me, if you could, a little bit about how you read the political situation right now.
Yeah, so domestically, it's definitely been a rally around the flag, rally around the president type thing. I mean, there's always going to be some hardcore critics of Zelensky, but when he came into power, I think he had over 70%, if not 80, almost 80% maybe. That was kind of steadily dropping as things weren't improving as much as people wanted, which is fine. I think to me that was just democracy. But yeah, when he stayed and didn't run, didn't even go to the West and just stood there like he's a comedian, but he's still a man, right? So he stood there. He's Ukrainian. So and being as young as he is, it's really motivating. It was motivating to see. I think it stiffened a lot of spines, especially in the first couple months. It was pretty critical that he was not killed, didn't run away. Now I think Ukrainians have already tested themselves where, it could be someone else in theory, but um, I think he's really good at the image because he's a comedian and showman. I mean, he's not just a comedian, stand-up comedian. He was a showman and actor, and he was one of the biggest acts in Russia too, up until the presidency. Basically, he was very, very popular in Russia, if you can believe that. And he's actually a native Russian speaker who now only speaks Ukrainian in public, things like that. But yeah, so I think almost all Ukraine, the overall majority still support him, so that's not going away anytime soon. I don't think. In terms of the West, yeah, definitely the most loyal friends have been countries like Poland and the Baltics, and those who suffered under the Soviets, except for Hungary, of course. Unfortunately, the only ones that suffered under the Soviets and still support Russia. But so support from especially Poland being the staging ground for Western weapons coming in. I mean, if you travel to Poland, you'll just see that it's a highway of stuff coming into Ukraine, which is amazing. But of course, the UK has been great, especially they call Boris Johnson. They kind of treat him as one of their own. They love him here. He could probably be next mayor of Kiev if he wanted to be. Things like that. But the bigger one people get most scared about is the Republican Party in the U.S. and what could happen. I just frame it this way. I tell my Ukrainian friends, I said, if you're still fighting this intensively in 2025, you got much bigger problems than whether it's Trump or someone else on the Republican side. So I think that's it's not a top 5 or even top 10 problem right now. You got what you got. 2025. They're still fighting against 2025 is just a dreadful thought. So I think, and then Russia trying to wait out Ukraine and the West. I think there's much more patience for that than the Russian people have patience for sending their sons into the slaughter and suffering the way that they're suffering as well. I mean, it's not just the Ukrainians. I mean, there's a lot of economic problems in Russia. Again, how many of the children have disappeared or killed in action, missing in action that haven't come. Eventually, it's going to come home to roost. Plus, you're seeing political fissures inside the country between different factions. You have the Chechen power, you have Wagner, a mercenary group. You have FSB, and you have the military, and then you have Putin. And these are all not necessarily one monolithic thing. They have competing interests. They don't trust the other sides. So,
but it seems like Putin is still, if not a dictator, close to a dictator.
He's definitely a dictator. He scares a lot of people, but no one can get close to him. There was even a scene just before the war started, where he's probably the number 4 guy total. It's the head of the CIA, not the KGB, FSB, which is KGB successor. It's the head of the overseas intel, and he made a mistake in speaking, and Putin called him out on it in public, and the guy started quivering. This is the number 4 guy in Russia, and he's looked like he was deathly afraid of making a mistake, and he was like stumbling upon himself, and it was just to show how much Putin scares everybody, even within his inner circle. So he's got his little Praetorian Guard / whatever that keeps him safe, but that can change at any time. So yeah, so I think if talking about a long run, like another year or 2 years, something like that. Like there was a great meme very, very beginning of the war where it's like Putin taking a pin and popping a balloon, and the balloon is Ukrainian flag colors. And as he goes to pop the balloon, he pops himself. And I think that's kind of indicators that, if he thinks he's going to destroy Ukraine, he's much more likely to feel blowback and tear apart his own country. Yeah, I think he's already done so much damage. I'm a Russophile. I love the history. I really, I lived there. I traveled to Trans-Siberia on the train. I saw it all. And just to see what he's done to that place in 2014, it's actually sickening. Even though I don't empathize with them much right now, it's just, because what they're doing to the country I live in and I love, but just what he's done to that country is just unconscionable. It's just disgusting.
Sean, we have obviously heard reports of rape and of torture, north of Kiev and the suburbs of Kiev in the initial invasion. We've seen the devastation in the east. We've talked about. You've mentioned the abduction of children and taking them to the east. Is this genocide?
Yeah, absolutely. They want to erase any traces of anything that's Ukrainian. They just say, no, you're one of us. You're a lost Russian, they kind of say. And the Ukrainian language isn't a language, it's just a dialect of Russian. I mean, just the denial of their statehood, stealing of children, that alone, that's why Putin hasn't been indicted, right, in the International Criminal Court, because they couldn't even deny it. They were out there, like he's out there talking to the main woman who's been running the program of, they call it adoption, but it's stealing children and trying to, make them into Russians. And there's no doubt they would do that to 85% of Ukraine, and just, they would leave Lvov and say that's basically Poland, go back to Poland, but they would definitely destroy it. They would tear apart the language. Again, the Soviets did the same thing. They killed millions of people. They denied the language. All these things that just to really wipe out Ukraine from the map and Ukrainians. So for me, 100% it's genocide.
Thanks for sharing your thoughts with us today, both on what it's like to live in Kiev right now and what's going to happen with the war. I really appreciate it. Please stay safe and check back in with us. We'd love to hear how things go with you and with Kiev and with Ukraine in the future.
All right. Thank you, Brian, for having me.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining Sean and supporting Sean and Ukraine in this war. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Kiev, I would presume, at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody. Thanks, Sean. Stay safe.
Thank you. Thanks.